On the heels of a really exciting response to our episode last month on distance learning, I want to thank everyone who tuned in, sent emails, communicated with us. We hope the school year is going well and safely for everyone. Hope everybody is staying connected. I'm your ever grateful host, Bill Culhane, here with the Big Bid Theory in Austin, Texas, US of A, powered by Bid Prime. Rick Jennings is in the other studio. Rick, I know it's fall, but as I was walking down the hall, I looked ahead. Is that a jacket you were wearing?
It is a jacket. It was a little cooler this morning. I finally decided to start whipping out some of the fall clothing once we started to see the 60s and the 70s in the forecast. So, it's getting closer to that time of year, and I'm a bigger fan of the super comfy winter clothes.
I'll let you know, Rick is always looking dapper. You as well, Kevin. This episode, over the years, we've had a number of conversations related to technology. We've also had Greg DiLoretto and Brian Palish on in two separate episodes. They were, you may recall, representing the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, and we discussed infrastructure.
Hey, Bill, I'm actually going to jump in here. Just to mention, in our day jobs, we continue to see activity from all these public sector agencies who are looking to address the ongoing issues with U.S. infrastructure, about how a lot of it needs to be maintained and upgraded and even replaced in a lot of cases.
That's a really good, oh, by the way. Today, we're going to kind of meld technology and one way to potentially address the gridlock issues hampering many parts of the U.S. We have a very special guest coming up to cover various aspects of autonomous vehicles, AVs. In Austin, here, I'm sure like many of you, we're not immune to the traffic, congestion, rush hour nightmares faced by many. Sure, COVID has had somewhat of an impact, but we can look out the windows of our studio here, and there are times where I-35 is a parking lot. And I see a lot of you folks out there nodding your heads. And Rick, I see you over there grimacing.
Yeah, it reminds me of my favorite thing to say to people whenever they ask if I like being in Austin. I'm sure it's the same with like major metropolitan areas around everywhere, but I tell people, yeah, I really like Austin whenever I'm outside of my car.
Yeah, if you're keeping score, Rick and I are not fans of bumper-to-bumper traffic. Like millions of you, however, we are fans of crazy bids. What's ahead, Rick?
So ahead in this episode for our crazy bid, we're going to be looking into a different kind of vehicle. Nothing like too out of the ordinary, but more of the implications, and the department that is requesting it is the interesting part there. Of course, along with what they're looking to do. So stay tuned, and you'll get to hear a pretty interesting crazy bid this week.
Cannot wait for that awesomeness. Before we introduce you to and bring in our guest, here's a brief message.
The Big Bid Theory is brought to you in part by Bid Prime. Over 11 years in changing the bid services industry, Bid Prime has become the solution for businesses serious about winning public sector business. From the premier technology in the industry to real-time bid notifications, supporting documents, and robust data tools, it's all backed by unmatched personalized customer support. Bid Prime. Start your free zero-obligation trial today. Bidprime.com.
As I mentioned, we're going to talk about autonomous vehicles. Our guest today is an authority on a variety of transportation issues. She's researched and written extensively on, a vast variety of those transportation-related topics. You guessed it, the list includes autonomous vehicles. She comes to us from right up the road, up I-35, that is, at the University of Texas. Dr. Kara Kockelman is a professor at the University of Texas. And being here in Austin, I always have to add Hookem when I mention UT. Dr. Kockelman is with UT's Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering. She earned her PhD in civil engineering from over there at the University of California at Berkeley. Along with her study of and research on self-driving, automated, and connected vehicles, she has also published an amazing amount of work on roadway pricing, travel demand, traffic safety, land use, transportation trade models, an analysis of spatial data traffic flow, and a lengthy list of other topics. It's really incredible stuff if you go to her page. As a matter of fact, that page, Kevin is going to insert a link to her background and research in the description of the episode. After you listen to our upcoming discussion, head over there.
I want to welcome you to the Big Bid Theory. We sure do appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill.
I mentioned to you the other day that previously we at the show, we visited with Marty Rogers. He's the director of Assure over at Mississippi State. Mr. Rogers and myself, we talked about unmanned aerial systems. Similar to that topic, there's so much to explore in discussing autonomous vehicles. And Dr. Kockelman, we'll use this as the launch point. In a moment, we're going to talk about specific uses, but what are the benefits of autonomous vehicles, AVs? What's gained from their development and adoption?
Well, on the private side, a lot of people, including people like you and me, don't want to drive or they don't want to pay a driver. So as you can imagine, in commercial operations, especially heavy-duty trucking, it's very expensive to pay somebody to steer that wheel and try not to crash for hours on end. And you and I would rather be doing more productive things inside our vehicles when we're moving around. But on the public side, the big issue really is safety. And so those two are both kind of neck and neck. Those are both worth about $1 trillion a year in this nation. And we're not going to go crash free, I don't think, by automating vehicles. And similarly, we still don't want to be trapped in a vehicle, even if we're able to look at our smartphone the entire time. But there's big savings to be made on both ends.
Just on a personal note, you made the comment about we don't want to drive. Recently, I drove to the University of Louisiana Monroe in Monroe, Louisiana, kind of tucked there in the northeast corner of the state of Louisiana. I drove up there and back. And so I completely agree with you that I would just as soon hand the driving over. So there are some of the benefits. Many are predicting that the autonomous vehicle industry could be worth many trillions of dollars within just the next few decades. What are some of the uses for autonomous vehicles? And I don't, of course, necessarily mean just public sector, military applications, but as you look across the board, how are these things being used?
Well, the reason Uber has a market capitalization value that's bigger than most, if not all, vehicle manufacturers in the world is because this is a killer application of robotics, is basically ferrying people around so they don't have to deal with parking. They don't even have to deal with maintaining the vehicle. It's like a magic carpet that drives them around when they want it, when they need it. So it comes to them, and then it helps do away with all of those vehicle ownership issues, but it also allows these vehicles to be heavily used, and they are expensive. So I don't really want to buy one of the early ones. It's going to be way beyond my budget level, and just owning a piece of it for a ride at a time is wonderful. And ideally also sharing those rides. So getting more people into the seats because the vehicles kind of keep track of who is suddenly asking for a ride in this corridor. We already have one or two people going. And of course, Uber and Lyft and other transportation network companies already do that all the time. But it does take pretty heavy demand before you start seeing those matches being made, so you can start filling up the vehicles, which is another nice benefit. So these are vehicles that might be used 100,000 miles a year, like heavy-duty trucks are right now, rather than the 10,000 miles a year that your car and my car on average would be used. And that's an excellent use of a very expensive asset. Same thing on the trucking side. Rather than moving 200,000 or 100,000 miles a year, they could maybe double that because the driver is really just an operator there for pickups and drop-offs and maybe doing administrative work en route and helping out if anything happens on the road. So much more effective use of the time of who is ever in there, and also using the asset for more hours each day.
Exciting. I almost sent you a note after you and I spoke a handful of days ago, and I guess we can file this under quite the coincidence, but you and I had our conversation, and that very day on my drive home, a full disclosure, Dr. Kockelman and myself, we each live in the greater Austin area. But anyway, on my drive home, I was listening to a radio show, and the three hosts were going on, and all of a sudden, the conversation turned to chit-chat about driverless cars. It instantly got my attention, and all three of the hosts were basically saying in unison, I'll never get in a driverless car. I'm too concerned about safety. And it went on and on for a few minutes. Well, for me, it kind of highlighted the all-important psychological challenges, what's being communicated by some out there when it comes to AVs. So, Dr. Kockelman, public trust is but one consideration. What are some of the roadblocks in creating public buy-in for the adoption of AVs?
Well, getting that experience firsthand or seeing your neighbor come home alive again and again in one of these vehicles is a really great way to make people feel more confident about it. And of course, all of us use self-driving vehicles all the time when we get in an elevator. And that was very scary, actually, when they got rid of elevator operators like in the 1920s, when they automated those elevators. We get in people movers all the time at airports, usually on tracks, but they do have these things happening in low-speed operations across European cities, mostly in pedestrian plazas and at low speed so that they don't hurt anybody because they don't want to be on the front page and make this concern or this fear even worse. But I do think people will adapt pretty quickly, given how a lot of Tesla drivers in the autopilot mode will just trust the car too much. They trust way too quickly, in fact. So that could be a real problem. There will be limitations on the application and use of them. So rainy days, foggy days, certain corridors where there tend to be a lot of crashes or complex driveway operations, higher speeds, those will not be the first application. So I don't think the auto manufacturers want their vehicles used in really risky settings where, there's just a higher outcome likelihood for injury or death. And that will help, put people's fears at ease and hopefully, just being in a vehicle for urban operations, maybe not a very high-speed operation, will feel very natural to a lot of people because we're often chauffeured around by other people who are much more fallible than some of these computer routines, and we don't give it a second thought. We start looking down at our phones or taking a nap, and we completely trust that driver.
I'm getting in an airplane tomorrow and flying across country. And so, I will sit in my seat with my mask on. I will sit in my seat, and you're right. I will pull up my phone until they tell me to put it in airplane mode, and I won't have a second thought. And I was having a conversation with my mother-in-law not too long ago, and we were talking about autonomous vehicles. And I don't want anybody to send me old guy jokes, but I thought to myself, and as she and I were having our conversation, I thought, well, I'm thinking back to the horse and buggy days once upon a time as automobiles were just starting to arrive on the scene. What must have been the thoughts of some people who were in their horse and buggy, riding their horse, and they see these automobiles go trucking on by? Is it maybe somewhat similar?
Sure. The engine under the hood, how can you trust that monster in there? You don't control it. But, of course, you don't control that horse either. And I do think that we will put conventional vehicles out to pasture at some point. You can pay to drive your vehicle on a test track. In 50 years from now, it's not even going to be permitted. It's simply not ethical to let humans drive on public roads at a certain point, given how often we tend to get distracted and make mistakes and crash, often ending people's lives.
Many questions are ahead that have to be answered for everyday people, for car makers, autonomy startups, and yes, this is the big bid theory, so I'm going to throw the public sector and government agencies in there as well. As you sit down, Dr. Kockelman, and look into your crystal ball, what do you predict for the AV industry, let's say over the next 5 years or so?
Well, there will be more demonstrations with regular people like you and me through an application on our phones, just like we call a Lyft vehicle right now. Those Lyft vehicles may be partnering with GM Cruise, for example, and you'll have maybe a Bolt show up. So that's an all-electric vehicle, thank goodness, but self-driving and potentially without a safety driver at all on board. And so it won't be a special ride where we get very, very lucky, but hopefully something that just kind of happens depending on how many of those they have in the fleet here in Austin and San Francisco and Boston and Pittsburgh and Phoenix. So lucky cities will have, 10 or more of these across 2 or more fleet operators that want to make sure that the technology is getting seen, is getting used by common people, not, high-tech industry people who have a special connection. And so that will probably be true in, 5 cities or more across this nation, including Miami. Sometimes it'll be robotic drop-off. So I think there are groups doing that right now in demonstration mode, but to really test it out with the average consumer is what we're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years.
Interesting stuff. And of course, our audience understands this. We will be keeping an eye on the AV industry in the coming months and years. In the intro to this segment, I mentioned the impressive body of work you have put together over your career. Are there any specific pieces of research or commentary which you believe our audience will find of particular interest?
Yeah, people love hearing about our shared autonomous vehicle fleet operations work. So we simulate these individual vehicles, thousands and hundreds of thousands of them, serving approximately 30 trips a day. So this could be one person traveling by himself or a couple people traveling together. And then we also simulate the likelihood of being able to share that ride with others, just the way Uber and Lyft are already doing that, and Didi in China and others around the world are doing this. So these are strangers that are sharing this mini bus together. It might be a 4-seater, or it could be a 6 or an 8, or maybe a 30-seater. And so we could even see our transit agencies doing this. And that's kind of what we're working on right now, is a mixture of different sizes on these vehicles. But our past work is about 4-seaters, and we're seeing that about 7 vehicles can be removed from the fleet right now in a place like Austin for every one of these vehicles. So they work kind of 7 times as hard as your vehicle and my vehicle. And then there's the empty driving in between. So they can be driving empty between a drop-off and a pickup. And so that ratio, 1 to 7, is really interesting. It is higher when we allow the ride sharing, so it can become a 1 to 8 rather than maybe a 1 to 6. It is lower when we electrify the vehicle, because it has to be recharged more often than like a hybrid vehicle. Like my Prius, can go 500 or more miles on a single fill up, which may take 5 minutes for me to do, whereas the Tesla Model 3 that we have, that's going to take 4 hours maybe of charging on a pretty low speed or low power charger. But if you speed up the charging, then a Tesla can really do almost the same work that a Prius can do, even though it does probably need to get charged at least once during that day and then again at night to be ready for the next day. So that's really interesting. Another thing we do is we look at the cost. So adding this technology certainly adds some cost, but the fact that you can share it over 30 different people a day and whoever they may be traveling with, that's worth a great deal. And so the actual cost of application might be as low as 50 cents per revenue mile. And so that starts to get lower than you and me owning a car and having to drive it and take care of it. And if, something goes wrong. And so having somebody else absorb all those costs is really nice, as long as there's competition. You don't want monopolistic pricing on this. You don't want only one operator before you give up your own vehicles and your own household fleet. And of course, the all-electric saves us a ton of energy and a ton of emissions. And smart charging allows us to add even more renewables to our feedstocks at our power generation plants. So we could be, 100% carbon-free, maybe 20% nuclear, 80% renewable. Price of batteries coming down. So this is becoming very, very competitive with that Prius I talked about, which is just a hybrid vehicle. We also look at geofencing, so how these fleets will perform differently in like a downtown versus core, or including the suburban fringe, and then maybe the exurban and the rural areas. And we're very surprised at if enough people are using the system, the wait times out in those really low density locations are great. They average maybe 7 minutes rather than 5 across the region, and 2-minute wait times downtown, which you'll often see when you call a Lyft vehicle, for example. So it's pretty amazing how well they work. but they do have to sit around sometimes. So there can be some curbs that are very busy. If people want to be picked up at their exact origin and dropped off at their exact destination, you can see some very busy curb spaces. So we started prohibiting use of the busier streets in our simulations of Austin and Minneapolis, St. Paul, for example, and Chicago, and making those vehicles go to a parking lot to wait, which is going to be very realistic for many street blocks, as you can imagine. And so that slows them down a little bit. But, you get rid of a lot of other vehicles that might be circling for a parking space or something, but you don't get rid of traffic. So one of the worst things about smart vehicles and self-driving vehicles is they make driving easier, which means we are going to be doing more of it. So unless we share those seats with strangers, we've got gridlock on our hands. And so a lot of my papers also look at something called credit-based congestion pricing. So the tolls basically through a GPS system with cellular, not those big overhead gantries that we have here in Texas, but a much cheaper system to run, sort of like having a phone in your car, but a phone that keeps track of how much you owe rather than, constantly beaming its position. So no third party knows where you are at all times, but your phone has a simple app to keep track of what the tolls are, depending on where it is, at what time of day, maybe even lane by lane. So we could have, slightly more expensive lanes on the inside lanes, versus the outside lanes of some of our roadways. And we can change it seamlessly like Singapore does. And I think, Hong Kong and others, and maybe Taiwan is actually really good at this. So these are technologies that are starting to emerge around the world. And of course, we've had road pricing in a lot of cities for a long time now, but just with the more traditional technologies. And by giving all the revenues back to all the travelers, it's credit-based. So they can use the revenues from our congestion tolls however they want for travel. They can rent an e-bike. They can get on a minibus, hopefully a self-driving minibus. Hopefully the transit agencies will be switching to this kind of operation, which is much more demand responsive and I think much more nimble than what we currently have.
Plenty of important and interesting work there. And as I mentioned in the lead-in to our conversation, Kevin will include a link to Dr. Kockelman's research page. That'll be in the description of the podcast. So I encourage everyone to give that a click, give that a look. The final thing, real quickly, Dr. Kockelman, as you went through your research, I heard you state, for example, our research we worked on. Everyone knows you're a professor at the University of Texas. So my question is, when things like autonomous vehicles come up in your classes, in your presentations, are young people excited about AV?
Sure. And so are old people, man.
Sure.
I have a mom who can't, drive at night. That'll be me in, a couple decades. It is even, at my current age, a little less safe for me to be driving at night. So it's just something that a lot of people, those with disabilities, those who have certain medical conditions that they're not allowed to have a driver's license, these are people who would love to see this technology right now. They're not scared. They're willing to pay $3 per mile. And of course, they already do sometimes when they hire a Lyft vehicle or a taxi, they're paying $2 a mile or more. So my students are the ones who do this, and they're all really excited. It's an easy topic to be excited about. And of course, we do also collaborate with faculty in other disciplines.
Absolutely. Of course. Well, Dr. Kockelman, on behalf of our audience and crew here at the show, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure.
So there you have it. What are your thoughts on autonomous vehicles, AVs? We want to know. Send over your emails. Would love to see what people are thinking out there. Now, segue, I'm going to send the microphone over to Rick for this week's Crazy Bids that you can win. Rick?
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to start out this crazy bid just with the title, and then I'll tell you who's looking for it, because that's the more, surprising part. So this bid title is the Autonomous Guided Vehicle, AGV, Eye in the Sky Production Deployment. What is that? That's basically like that's like a system that kind of harbors in drones and tells them to go look for particular things to pick up, move around, things like that. And this bid is being solicited by the United States Postal Service. So what they're trying to do is they're looking for a company that can like roll out the production deployment of this AGV system. And so it uses utilizes a sensor and camera system, and they mount it from the ceiling, and this system detects the presence or even like absence of stock containers and pallets, and it's supposed to read the equipment labeler and the barcode to tell like what this package is and things like that. And it automatically calls for one of these vehicles to pick up and drop off that package at its appropriate destination. So basically, they're just trying to make this package delivery a little bit more efficient internally so that these can go to the right places to like the right trucks and whatnot to send it out for delivery. And of course, probably everyone listening to this has been to a post office and has felt so sorry for everyone having to sort out everything by hand behind the counter. So if nothing else, I'm really glad that they're hopefully going to get this solution that can help them out with this. And even just thinking further from there, I mean, it's really exciting to think about if this is just how they can do something internally. What if they turn that into something they can do externally from this? So if you can imagine basically waiting on a package that's supposed to come in from the Postal Service and then that getting delivered straight to your door by an awesome looking drone, how cool would that be? I mean, I have a package in the mail that was supposed to get to me about 2 weeks ago or so, and I would just not be upset at all over like time lost if it were to be delivered to me by a really neat looking drone straight into my hands. That would be really neat. So that's kind of what I'm hoping that this idea really branches into. And if you are interested in making that dream really work for all of us, then that is this week's crazy bid that you can win.
Nice job, Rick. And again, very nice jacket. That'll do it. We thank you for sharing, downloading, and following our show, The Big Bid Theory. Continue to email us. We so much appreciate the feedback. My email is bcolhane@bidprime.com. Follow us on Twitter @The Big Bid Theory. My Twitter handle is contract_hunter. Don't forget the underscore. Please head to our Facebook page and give it a like if you can do that as well. We do appreciate it. Powered by Bid Prime for Rick Jennings and Mr. Kevin Henderson. We thank Dr. Cara Kockelman for her time. You're now more informed. How do you feel about autonomous vehicles? They're coming. This is Bill Colhane. Until next time, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs. And we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Powered by Bid Prime, we thank you for tuning in to The Big Bid Theory. From Austin, Texas, the show is produced by Bill Colhane and Jim Ward. Producer and engineer is Rick Jennings. Distribution, research, and production assistance by Kevin Henderson. You can find other episodes of the show on platforms such as iHeart, iTunes, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, and others. As always, thank you for downloading and sharing the podcast.
We're having so much fun.